We're now at the end of what has turned out to be 7 videos on Soren Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments. My favorite work by Kierkegaard, and one that I think actually brings together a lot of the really important themes in his work. And so what we're going to do in this is consider what he calls the disciple at second hand, the case of the second-hand disciple. And what we'll see is that there actually is no disciple at second hand, according to Kierkegaard, by the very end. So before we do that, a little bit of review, a little bit of recounting of where we've come. He distinguished from the very beginning between a Socratic way of looking at things, where the teacher reveals to the student what the student actually already knows, what already is in the student. The teacher doesn't give something to the student that the student didn't have. The teacher merely takes them out of the error that they were in and leads them to the truth that's within themselves. And the teacher then becomes, you might say, supplementary or no longer needed. And it can be replicated indefinitely. He contrasted that against a sort of religious way of looking at things, where the teacher is providing to the student something the student couldn't possibly have, doesn't have within themselves, reveals to them the condition that they're actually in, and shows them that the roots of the error lie ultimately within themselves and their relationship to something greater than them. That teacher can never be replaced. That teacher always needs to stay, you might say, at least on the horizon, and can't be passed on, can't be replicated in terms of the merely human. And then, of course, he talked about other ways of teaching and learning, and he said that these are all inferior, ultimately, to even the Socratic. So the Socratic was the highest that human beings on their own, human reason unaided, could bring about. The religious opened up an entire new dimension in which all of these things could be situated, in which the Socratic could be made sense of, in which the gaps that it's not able to perceive could be taken into account, in which some sort of what he calls happy passion of understanding between the paradox, which is God, and reason, or consciousness, the human being, could take place through faith. And along with that was the possibility of offense. Anytime that there's the possibility of faith, there's likewise the possibility of offense, where there's an unhappy relationship between the paradox and the human being. So now he is bringing us to the point where he wants to ask about how it is that we learn from each other, that we pass on things that we might call traditions, that anything like institutional religion could have a role in people's lives. And Kierkegaard is going to, again, as he's done before, take a very radical position. For Kierkegaard, every single believer, if they really are a believer, have to be, in effect, where the first believers were. Where that first generation who actually walked and ate and communicated and were puzzled by and were sorrowed and jubilated by this God, become man, this God entered into time. Every single believer has to, if they are truly a believer for Kierkegaard, they have to be there. That doesn't mean that they have to be at that point in time, or that they have to, say, dress in the clothing of first century AD Palestine, or talk that way, or maybe not even necessarily use the same sort of concepts. But the relationship of faith that he's sketching out has to be like that. So let's see how he actually gets there. He talks about the contemporary disciples, contemporary Christians in this case. And he says, we have to figure out, how is it that there can be the same experience, the same fundamental relation, the same connection to the divine in 1843, or we might say in 2013, as was possible in AD 33. How can this actually be the case? And he says this is the disciple not only at second hand, but you could multiply the generations, right? So he says, let's think about the relation between the secondary disciple and the contemporary disciple. And let's look at the differences between them and how they are also similar. So he says, we're going to cut off the discussion, and it's not in an arbitrary place. He says, for this reason, it's not arbitrary to cut off the discussion where we please. The relative differences, the going from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, the relative differences here in question constitute no sorry taste. Now, what is a sorry taste? A sorry taste is an extended argument where you say, well, if A, then, this is just one example of a sorry taste. If A holds, then B holds, and if B holds, then C holds. So we know that if A, then C, and now let's add another joint to it and say, well, if C, then D, and if D, then E, and we know that C actually holds now because we started out way over here, so we can jump from there to there. And you can have all sorts of arguments that have long, complicated structures with many steps along the way. Those are sorry tastes in traditional argument studies, rhetoric and logic. So he says we don't actually have a sorry taste here. There's no new quality that can be made to emerge because they're all comprised within a common quality. Everybody's in the same sort of case. He says, a sorry taste would arise only if we subjected the concept of contemporaneity, of actually being present in time, in relation with the event, to a false dialectic. And what would be some examples of this? You could, for example, try to show that in a certain sense nobody could be a contemporary because nobody could be contemporary with every moment or phase. So you could set up what we would call a sophism, a false type of argument, a misleading type of argument, and say, well, unless somebody is contemporary in every single sense at every single moment of time, they're not really a contemporary, so therefore nobody's a contemporary of Christ. Nobody's a contemporary of the teacher. Another way you could say, where does the contemporary leave off and the contemporaneity begin? You're trying to impose some sort of rigid dividing line between the two of them. Did, for example, Peter's household, who heard about Christ but weren't actually in his presence, were they contemporaries or weren't they contemporaries? For instance, the centurion, right? Or all the people that were later on converted in the book of Acts. Would they be not contemporaries or would they be contemporaries? Kierkegaard says, really, that's missing the point to frame it like that. Another way, would there exist a Twilight Zone subject to bargaining, of which the prating understanding might say to a certain degree and so forth? So, can you say, well, somebody is kind of a contemporary of the teacher or the paradox, but maybe only 95%. And this person over here is 75%, and this person is even less. Once you start trying to look at it in those sorts of ways, Kierkegaard would say, you're missing the point. You're framing things according to what he called the false dialectic. You're framing things in such a way as to prevent yourself from actually seeing what's going on and understanding what it is that he's saying. So he says, all these inhuman profundities lead nowhere, or perhaps in our day they may lead to a reputation for genuine speculative insight. He's bashing the contemporary philosophers of his time. So, instead, what are we going to do? We're going to look at a few basic features of the contemporary disciple, the disciple who's connected with the teacher, who walks, eats, sleeps, spends time with him, and the disciple at second hand or third hand or fourth hand, the disciple who's removed. So he says, let's look at the first generation of secondary disciples. That's the really key thing to focus on, because everybody is in the same sort of boat, right? If you're going to say, well, we didn't see it firsthand, in a way, it doesn't matter how many hands it passes through. There's first hand and then there's all the other hands. So he says, the generation that comes immediately after enjoys the relative advantage of being nearer to an immediate certainty, of being nearer to the attainment of an exact and reliable account of what happened, from witnesses whose reliability is subject to collateral control. But he says to be nearer in this way is actually an illusory advantage. For he who is not so near to immediate certainty as to be immediately certain is absolutely separated from it. You can't, according to Kierkegaard, sort of build up probabilities and then wind up with certainty at the end. He says, suppose we try to estimate the value of this relative difference, that which marks the first generation of secondary disciples over against later ones. How great a value shall we assign to it? Well, we can evaluate it only by comparing it with the advantage enjoyed by a contemporary. So we can only make sense of this by looking at, what somebody who actually was there, who is an eyewitness, would have received. They're the sort of touchstone. So he says, let's take a thought experiment again. One of these made-up kind of cases. Suppose there lived a man in the immediately succeeding generation who combined in his own person a tyrant's power with a tyrant's passion, and suppose this man had somehow conceived the idea of concentrating his entire time and energy upon the problem of bringing the truth to light on this point. Would this constitute him a disciple? He goes even further. Suppose he possessed himself of all the contemporary witnesses still living, together with the immediate circle of their associates. Suppose he subjected them one by one to the most searching inquisition, shutting them up in prison like the 70 interpreters, that is the translators of the Septuagint, starving them in order to make him tell the truth, confronting them with one another in the craftiest possible manner, all for the sake of making sure by every possible means of a reliable account. Now, this is an interesting sort of image, isn't it? And you have to do a lot of imagining to make this actually work. Who does this really seem like in our own time? This actually seems like certain schools of scholarship, doesn't it? The idea is if we can just assemble enough reliable witnesses and subject them to the most techniques that are going to bring out all the possible little contradictions and collate and examine all this sort of stuff, we can sort of weed out the things that are false or unreliable from the things that we can say, we have absolute certainty about this. And maybe some of it we have to say it's probable. Will that actually give you the person that it's supposed to give you? Will those sorts of techniques applied to the New Testament witnesses and all the other things that you could possibly find connected to that, would those actually provide you with the connection to the reality of who this guy, Jesus, was? The connection between God and man in time. So he says, even if the fact that we were to speak of were a simple historical fact, this is really an interesting insight here that he has. Even if it were just talking about a single historical fact, like think about a case at law, right? What do you notice about witnesses? If you've actually served on any sort of, not necessarily a jury, but some sort of panel where you have to cross-examine people and you have to try to get to the story of what took place, one of the things that you want to figure out fairly quickly on is that when stories are perfect, when they provide you with complete certainty, they're usually lies. And when there's small inconsistencies that actually don't seem to lead anywhere necessarily, small inconsistencies and contradictions in a person's account and then the other person's account, odds are they're actually telling the truth. Because reality is complicated, and our memory of it is often, somewhat unreliable. And the only person who really has a stake in making sure that their story is absolutely airtight is somebody who's actually trying to fool you, somebody who's trying to get one over on you. So Kierkegaard talks about this, and he says, It's a familiar fact that the most conscientious and truthful of witnesses are the first to involve themselves in contradiction when subjected to inquisitorial treatment and questioned in the light of an inquisitor's fixed idea. That doesn't mean that they're not true. That means that the inquisitor is actually, by their sort of insistence, by their sort of everything has to fit into these categories, they're actually producing the falsity there that they're going to charge the person with. On the other hand, it's the prerogative of a hardened criminal on account of the precision which an evil conscience tends to enforce, not to contradict himself in his lie. The people who are actually the most consistent, the people who are actually, the most sure of themselves, are usually the ones who are either, complete saints, which are fairly rare, or the complete bastards. The people who, have lied to themselves over and over again so much that they actually believe their lies. The rest of us are kind of, neither here nor there. And, we can expect the same thing of the witnesses to the teacher, the paradox, who comes into history. So, he says, putting all this aside, let's say that this tyrant, this imaginary person, was able to get this account with perfect precision. If he succeeded in bringing to pass a complicated account consistent to the letter and to the minute, he would beyond doubt be deceived. He would have obtained a certainty even greater than was possible from a contemporary observer. There's always this notion that scholars seem to have that we're going to examine the documents and the witnesses and sort of coerce them into an account, and we'll have a better understanding of things than Peter or Paul or any of the other people, around that time had, because they were, not as smart as us. And this was common back in Kierkegaard's time, just as it's common in our own time. So he says, if you actually think about this, what would an account like that be? A contemporary would constantly be reminded he did not see or hear the God immediately, but merely a humble human being who said of himself that he was the God. In other words, he would be constantly reminded that the fact in question was based on a self-contradiction. Would this man then gain anything by reason of the reliability of his account? He's talking about the tyrant again. Historically speaking, yes, but otherwise not. Why not? Well, because, like he points out, there's several important features of this kind of account that's important. He says, divinity is not an immediate characteristic. You can't look at something and say, aha, there's God. You have to be ready to recognize, aha, there's God. You have to be willing to sort of extend yourself, to not be scandalized by the divinity. The teacher must develop in the learner the most profound self-reflection, the sense of what? Sin. There's what Kierkegaard is saying, there's a notion here that without consciousness of what one really is, a sinful human being, one can't recognize the divinity when it presents itself to one. Pride, Kierkegaard isn't using these terms. These are sort of earlier categories that you find the medievals talking in terms of. Pride keeps one from being able to recognize God where God shows up. Humility is what opens the possibility for that. And humility doesn't mean self-abasement. Humility means recognizing oneself as one truly is. What about miracles? It says a miracle does not exist for immediate apprehension, but only for faith. So it takes this happy passion of faith, this understanding that it provides, to be able to rightly read the signs, you might say. So what's the advantage then of the generation that he's talking about? He says, they have the relative advantage in one way, of being nearer to the shock produced by the impact of our fact. When Christ comes, in many ways, not just in one way, but in many ways, he is a scandal, a shock. He, is a divider as well as, a uniter. The very notion of God becoming man, it seems to be logically, self-contradictory, at least in the way that it was understood there. So this is a shock. So The shock and its reverberations will help to arouse the attention. So the attention is aroused. The significance of such an aroused attention has already been evaluated before in chapter 4, where he's talking about the contemporary disciple. And he says, this advantage is not really an advantage. Why not? If you think about it in terms of time, you have the paradox coming into history, the eternal entering into human history, God becoming man, fully God, fully man, and the contemporary disciple is there, and the disciple who's there at the time, they are close to the shock, the event that takes place. Now this shock can go one of two ways, and for each person at any given point in time undergoing that shock, because of the attention that they're giving it, it goes one of two ways. So he says the advantage from the shock is dialectical, like the aroused attention itself. It consists in having one's attention aroused, whether the result is that one believes or is offended. So both faith or offense can result from this. Many did believe, many didn't believe. So the advantage is, like he says, that a state of mind is induced in which the crucial nature of the decision confronting the individual becomes more clearly evident. Things are brought to a crux. That's the only advantage. And like he says, it's an illusory advantage for the contemporary disciple or the disciple immediately afterwards. Now he goes fast forward all the way down to the last generation. So, the last generation for him is his contemporaries of what he called Christendom. The last generation for us would be, contemporary world, the Christians that we know. Or, not just the Christians that we know. Anybody who comes in contact with the message and is going to think about it. So it would include a lot of atheists as well. So long as they keep thinking about it. Even if they're constantly rejecting it, they're still part of that generation. And if this video, survives 200 years and somebody's seeing it, well, then this would be about third generation, right? So Kierkegaard is saying the last generation. Now, he says, if God comes into the world as the absolute paradox, then nothing changes that. Nothing that happens subsequently can avail to change this. The consequences will in all eternity remain the consequences of a paradox. So the same situation is being offered to disciples at second hand, at third hand, all the way down to whatever hand we happen to be at right now. There is what appears to be an advantage coming from this. What's the advantage? He calls this naturalisation, which means that things get easier. What do we mean by this? Well, remember, Kierkegaard is somebody who is arguing for Christianity, and he's always arguing against Christendom, what he sees as a culture that has made Christianity as a way of actually living, thinking, choosing, being in the world, coming into existence, as we saw before, too easy. Easier than it ought to be, and therefore changed it in the process, taken people away from genuine Christianity. So he says, the advantage of the consequences. What are the consequences? The consequences are, throughout history, people, think about, for example, when Christ first came on the scene and said, forgive your enemies, that was a pretty radical thing to say. And when he healed the ear of the servant that had been cut off by one of his own guys, trying to defend him, that was an example of that. And then he goes and gets crucified, gets killed. And so saying, you should forgive your enemies, that was really scandalous at the time in many ways. It's a hard saying, as they say. Well, some of the hard sayings get made easier. Now imagine that you're within a culture where that becomes the norm because it's been so thoroughly Christianized that everybody is, now trying to forgive their enemies and all that. Now some people would say, well, see, that culture has actually embodied Christianity and made an advance, and it's going to be easier for the disciples at second hand or whatever hand to sort of embrace this. And Kierkegaard says, that's not an advantage either. That's an illusory advantage. He says, if such is the case, if this sort of thing actually could be what takes place, the latter generation has a direct advantage over the contemporary generation. Under the assumption of naturalization, it would be possible for a later generation, keep going long enough, to appropriate the fact without the slightest embarrassment, without seeing anything of the ambiguity of the aroused attention, without going through that shock of saying, holy crap, what the hell is this? That Christianity, at least as Kierkegaard sees it, makes a person have to go through. And then, having to go through the, am I going to accept and try to embrace and understand and allow myself to be transformed, not only in my actions, but also even in my mind by this? Or am I going to find offense with it and say, this can't possibly be. I am smarter than this. This is folly. Any sort of thing like that. Well, let's say you could give somebody a nice handbook after a while that would say, okay, you're going to go through this moment, and you're going to be tempted to be offended, but don't do that, because look, here's where you want to go, and that was effective every single time. Well, then it really wouldn't be a choice, now would it? There would be no real shock. There would be no awareness of one's own condition. Christianity would have become, as he says, naturalized. He says of the paradox, it is and it remains the paradox, and it cannot be assimilated by any speculation, even by Hegel's. Hegel did a very good job trying to make a case for that, but Kierkegaard says that doesn't work. This fact of the paradox exists for faith alone. Faith may indeed become the second nature, he says, of a man, but the man in whom it becomes a second nature must surely have had a first nature. In order to be able to have faith, in order for nature to become transformed, supernaturalized, you might say, enter into a fertilizing relation with the supernatural, you actually have to have a nature, and that nature, as Christianity tells you, as the paradox reveals it, is a damaged nature, so damaged that it continues its own damage within itself. And even when it tries to understand the damage, unless it actually accepts the helps that it needs from the paradox, it makes the damage even worse. That's not going to go away, according to Kierkegaard. So, he says, if all this is the case, everything that we've proposed in the first chapter would be confounded. If you actually could overcome, all the scandal of Christianity just by waiting around long enough for everybody to sort of take it in and be okay with it, then all the other stuff he's saying wouldn't make sense. Let's go on. So he says the advantage afforded by the consequences is dubious for another reason too, insofar as the consequences don't actually follow directly as simple consequences. And again, we say the same move as with the tyrant who wanted to have that perfect account. The trouble is, in order to see things that pertain to faith, the paradox, the supernatural, as such, you actually have to interpret. You actually have to extend yourself. There's no, smack you in the face and tell you, see, here it is. Here's the evidence. You actually have to be you have to be willing to see evidence as evidence for it to count as evidence. So he says, The advantage afforded by the consequences is dubious for another reason. Let us assess the advantage of the consequences at its highest maximum and assume that this fact has completely transformed the world. So you've had this continual progression in which Christianity has sort of reached its claws into the culture and changed things and modified the very ways in which people understand themselves and in which they conceive of their relations with other people, society, all these sorts of things, right? So Christianity becomes progressively less and less scandalous. How does this come to pass? This is a really good question. So surely not at once. I mean, that's not the way history takes place. That's not the way revolutions take place, right? All at once. No, it takes place with a bunch of steps, a bunch of, an advance here and an advance here and an advance here and an advance here, and oftentimes with a lot of pushback. An example of this would be what monasticism developed as and then brought into Western culture, a lot of which has been lost, unfortunately, brought into Western culture by being sort of the ones who were passing on learning, the ones who were embodying how to live a society in which people could more or less get along with each other. And if you actually read some of the letters that these monks wrote to each other, this was not easy. They actually, didn't always get along. It wasn't heaven on earth. So anyway, by a succession of steps, how are these steps taken? This is a very important point. By each particular generation, again coming into relationship with this fact, with the paradox. Every generation that is going to transform the world, and in some sense, whatever that may be, make it more Christian and make it easier to understand the Christian message and the Christian choice and the Christian way of life. Every generation that does that can only do that by their relationship of faith with God, with the paradox, by embracing the paradox and making that part of their practice and their theory and their community. So he says, this intermediary determination must be brought under control, or may not a misunderstanding also have consequences, may not a lie also be powerful, and has it not happened so to each generation? If now the previous generations collectively propose to bequeath to the last the whole splendid array of consequences without further ado, wouldn't that represent a misunderstanding? I have, for example, in my library, the collected works of the ante-Nicene and post-Nicene fathers that I happen to get at a steal from I think it's Christian booksellers, distributors, or something like that. And that doesn't make me any better of a Christian, or even necessarily offer me an understanding of Christianity, even if I work my way, and I probably won't work my way in my lifetime, although I want to do this, through all those volumes and read all those great, saints and fathers and doctors who really lived a life, devoted to developing their relationship to the divine and really have a lot to say about it, a lot of intelligent stuff. It's not going to do me any good, according to Kierkegaard, unless I've also developed that relation as well. Unless I'm reading them through the lens which is provided by that. If I'm reading them merely as a historian or as a philosopher or even as what a lot of people think of as a theologian, I'm going to miss something. I may learn a lot, but I'm going to miss what's at the heart of it. So he says something really interesting here. Consequences founded on a paradox are, humanly speaking, built over a yawning chasm, and their total content, which can be transmitted to the individual only with the express understanding that they rest on a paradox, are not to be appropriated as a settled estate. Not something where you can say, oh yeah, I get this, and it's my inheritance, and I just kind of live it out. A lot of people who grow up within a religious tradition have that sort of view that, I know everything that there is to know about this because I grew up with it. Well, unless you've actually assimilated it and struggled with it and thought about it and been puzzled about it and had to go beyond yourself, and not just to somebody else, but go beyond yourself to God to make sense out of it, Kierkegaard would say, you're actually not getting it. That inheritance doesn't do you any good. Let's go a little bit further now. So he talks now about the first generation of secondary disciples. Again, he says they have this advantage. The difficulty is always there. And that, the fact that it is difficult, that's actually an advantage. If we go on to the problem of the disciple at second hand, right? We've got this sort of viewpoint here. We want to try to figure out what is their relationship to the divine. Is it mediated solely through the other generation of contemporary disciples? And he says we have to think about this in terms of history and time and the absolute. So one of the things that he says here, and I'm actually skipping over some material, he says, if the fact in question is an absolute fact, or to determine it more precisely, if it is the fact that we have described, namely that the absolute enters into time, into history, into human meaning, that God becomes fully man, it would be a contradiction to suppose that time had any power to differentiate the fortunes of men with respect to it, that is to say, in any decisive sense. So if this is an absolute fact, then that fact has to be just as accessible for anybody coming along later on as it was for the one who was right there at that point, at what we call the Christ event. So he says, the absolute fact is also a historical fact. Unless we're careful to insist on this point, our entire hypothesis is nullified, and then we speak only of an eternal fact. So he's making a difference between an absolute fact, an eternal fact, and an historical fact. And these are all interconnected. It says the absolute fact is a historical fact, and as such it is for what? The object of faith. So it's not a historical fact in the same sense as Washington crossing the Delaware and somebody writing about that. It requires a person to actually extend themselves in faith to that, to interpret that as an absolute fact. So he says, the historical aspect must indeed be accentuated, but not in such a way it becomes decisive for the individuals. And neither can the historical aspect of our fact be eliminated, for then we have only an eternal fact. This is what happens when people try to turn Christianity or try to turn the figure of Jesus Christ into, the teacher for all time who's basically like Socrates and Lao Tzu and pick whoever else you like. And you ignore the historicity. You ignore the fact that, look, this point in time was chosen. These actions were done. These sayings were said and preserved. So he says, now, just as the historical gives occasion for the contemporary to become a disciple, but only it must be noted through receiving the condition from God itself. What is the condition? Becoming aware of one's own case, that one is sinful, that one needs assistance, that one needs grace in order to prosper, to have the scales lifted, in order to make progress. Since otherwise, he says, we speak Socratically, so the testimony of contemporaries gives occasion for each successor to become a disciple. But only it must be noted through receiving the condition from the God himself. So, what I'm going to say, I've been gesturing over here to this. This is the wrong way to look at it, Kierkegaard would say. Because the question always becomes then at this point, well, how does this guy, or people, or generation, how does the message come through them? Because now we're talking about, human beings. And how does this divine message actually make it through them, and so that this generation actually has the same experience, the same possibilities, the same fullness that this generation had? Kierkegaard says, well, it doesn't. That's not the way it works. So this is the better diagram right here. You have the paradox, God becoming man, and the paradox gives the condition to the contemporary disciple to actually realize what they are, to set reason when it needs to be set aside, to have the relationship then of faith and then the contemporary disciple passes something on to the other disciple. But what they pass on is not faith. What they pass on is not the condition. What they do is they provide what Kierkegaard says is an occasion. They provide an instance. They provide some talking points. They provide, hey, let's explore this. They may provide sometimes a scandal. You know, think about a Christian, for example, who acts the way many Christians do, including myself, in ways that are contrary to the message of Christianity, and is not, entirely reformed the way that we ought to be. Another disciple, potential disciple, might look at that and say, "See those damn Christians? They're so full of it." But somebody else might look at that and say, "How come that person isn't like this person over here who they're supposed to be connected with? Man, I want to be like that person." Sometimes even scandalizing another person can be an occasion for them to receive the condition from God and for them to develop a relationship of faith as well. That's what Kierkegaard is saying here. So he says, now we're ready to begin. This is deep in the chapter. He says, now we're actually ready to begin. From the God himself, everyone receives the condition who by virtue of the condition becomes the disciple. So the immediate contemporaneity of the contemporary disciple is merely an occasion. What becomes then of the disciple at second hand? He says, for whoever has what he has from the God himself clearly has it at first hand, right? And he who does not have it from the God himself is not a disciple. This is a big problem if you look at it this way. I'm going to skip ahead and then we're going to come back and look at some ways that don't actually fit this. Because he tells you what it is that corresponds to this diagram that I've put there. He says, if we wish to express the relation subsisting between a contemporary and a successor in the briefest possible compass, but without sacrificing accuracy to brevity, we may say the successor believes by means of the testimony of the contemporary, and in virtue of the condition he himself receives from God. So by means of the testimony that he gets from the contemporary disciple or from other generations prior to that, right? Or later than that as well. For instance, think about having the Bible, right? I mean, the Bible has to be written down. The New Testament, in particular, is coming, after. And it has to be assembled. And then people have to keep writing it and transmitting it and explaining it. That provides the means, right? In virtue of the condition that the person receives from the God, is the person able to have faith. So he says the testimony of the contemporary provides an occasion for the successor, just as the immediate contemporaneity, actually being there with the paradox, the God-man, provides an occasion for the contemporary. And he says if the testimony is not of this nature, then it's either by a historian, and it does not deal essentially with the object of faith, as when a contemporary historian who is not a believer recounts one or another fact, or it's by a philosopher, and it doesn't deal with the object of faith either. Only a testimony which is providing an occasion in this way, and not trying to sort of wrap everything up, into the eternal or into the purely historical, can be the means for a person to have this relationship of faith with God, according to Kierkegaard. So he says, there actually is no disciple at second hand. The first and last are essentially on the same plane. Only that a later generation finds its occasion in the testimony of a contemporary generation, while the contemporary generation found its occasion in its immediate contemporaneity, and insofar owes nothing to any other generation. Now let's skip back a little bit. I mean, this is really interesting stuff to say. every single person throughout all time is in a position where they have just as much access, according to Kierkegaard, to the paradox, to its transformative capacities, to the relationship that it offers. Every single person, whether they were there and walked and ate with the God-man, or whether they are off, a million years from now, so long as there's actually some sort of testimony still going on, even if the testimony got garbled in the process, it doesn't matter, because the testimony is merely an occasion. The reality, the God-man, the paradox, is what provides the condition to whatever generation of believers we're talking about to actually develop in faith. That's how things go right. Let's look at a few ways in which things could go wrong. So he asks, how can things go wrong? If the contemporary disciple gives the condition to the successor, then the successor will come to believe in him. Then that person assumes the role of God. They take the space of God. And God could, so to speak, just pop out of the picture, right? We would erase the paradox. And perhaps this person then becomes the paradox. That's a form of idolatry. Kierkegaard isn't discussing it as such, but that's what we're in effect talking about. He says he receives the condition from him, and thus the contemporary becomes the object of faith for the successor. Such a meaningless consequence will surely deter thought from making this assumption, Kierkegaard says. And that's an interesting thing for him to say, particularly, I think that's not Kierkegaard himself talking. I think maybe that's Kierkegaard in the guise of this philosopher who's exploring these things. And he says, if on the contrary the successor also receives the condition from the God, then the Socratic relationships will return, of course, within the total difference constituted by the fact in question. What then can a contemporary do for a successor? He says, he can inform him that he has himself believed this fact, which is not in the strict sense of communication, but merely affords an occasion. For when I say that this or that has happened, I make a historical communication. But when I say, and this is important for Kierkegaard, I believe, when I make an act of belief, we would say, when I express that, when I affirm that, I believe and have believed that so-and-so has taken place, although it is a folly to the understanding and an offense to the human heart, then I have simultaneously done everything in my power to prevent anyone else from determining his own attitude in immediate continuity with mine. I'm not bringing any pressure to bear. If I tell you, when you ask me, why do you believe in Christianity? And I say, like Kierkegaard is saying, attributing this to Tertullian. And I know that people point out that Tertullian isn't saying exactly this, but I believe because it's absurd. I'm certainly not making it easy for anyone else to follow along with me and say, oh, well, he thinks it's true, so I'm going to think it's true too. I'm sort of like, keeping people at arm's distance and offering them the possibility of figuring this stuff out for themselves. So he says, in this form he can relate the content to the fact, but this content exists only for faith. This is really interesting too. When you read other people's conversion narratives, it may be that a portion of that narrative only really makes sense to you when you've experienced something similar, and not something similar just in the sense of like, we all went to camp together, but something similar that actually, shocked you and shook you and allowed you to be formed and reformed, as Anselm says in some of his works, formed and reformed. Let's go on now. And so Kierkegaard is bringing these things to a close, and he says, there is no disciple at second hand. How are we going to end this? And he says, I'm going to actually finish just by pointing out this thing. He says, it's well known that Christianity is the only historical phenomenon which, in spite of the historical, nay, precisely by means of the historical, has intended itself to be for the single individual. That's a very important Kierkegaardian theme that we see. The single individual who has value in the eyes of the paradox. The point of the departure for his eternal consciousness. He's interested in the historical, and he's also interested in the fact that we have eternal consciousness. And a consciousness that we only truly grow into or understand or explore the contours of by means of our relationship to the paradox. If we choose to be offended, we cut ourselves off from actually exploring that eternal consciousness. If, on the other hand, we choose the relationship of faith, then we open the door to that, according to Kierkegaard. So here's where he's going to end. He says, no system of philosophy addressing itself only to thought, no mythology addressing itself solely to the imagination, no historical knowledge addressing itself to the memory, has ever had this idea. The paradox itself, as we saw back in chapter 3, the paradox itself gives the idea. This is a gratuitous gift, also coming in through history. This is a way in which Christianity put something into or before or offered to philosophy, something that could actually transform it, that could allow philosophy to be more than what it had been, just in the sort of Socratic or later on Hegelian mode, which was the highest that Kierkegaard thinks man was capable of. The person of the God-man coming into time changes the landscape for philosophy, but only if philosophy is willing to recognize that. It's possible for it to take offense. And it's always going to be, somewhat uneasy and at odds with it. This is where we see Kierkegaard, again, doing what it is that Christian philosophers do, according to sort of classical formulations of this. That is, take a theological or religious reality and try to come up with some sort of philosophical understanding, articulation, or explanation of it. That's what he's done here in terms of all of the themes that we've discussed, and finally in terms of the relationship between these different disciples back to the teacher throughout time, history, and culture.